From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David. How are you doing today?
Good, and I stand corrected. Climate change is real.
We finally got through to you.
He's only kidding.
Okay. Well, that voice is the man of the hour, Ralph Nader, who wants to make sure that you know that David is only kidding. Ralph, David is always kidding. How are you doing, Ralph?
Fine. We have one of the most important books of the decade to talk about, which is published this month. So hang on, listeners. This affects you every hour of the day and night.
Wow. We're going to have to live up to that. Well, last week we talked about how Amazon is trying to take over the world and that the current definitions of monopoly and antitrust law do not keep up with the challenges that phenomenon poses. So today we widened the discussion to include not only what high tech is doing to the market, but what it is also could be doing to our minds. Our only guest today is journalist and author Franklin Foer, whose new book is World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. At some point, we will take a break and check in, as always, with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And the rest of the show will be devoted to your listener questions. And Ralph is going to weigh in on the new Medicare for All bill that Bernie Sanders just introduced. So let's get right to it. David?
Franklin Foer is a national correspondent for The Atlantic and a fellow at the New America Foundation. For 7 years, he edited the New Republic magazine. He is the author of How Football Explains the World, which has been translated into 27 languages and won a National Jewish Book Award. The Daily Beast called Mr. Foer one of America's most influential liberal journalists. His latest work, and the subject of our conversation today, is entitled World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Franklin Foer.
So happy to be here.
Yes, welcome indeed, Frank. Liberal, conservative, it doesn't matter. These big tech companies are going after all of us. And your book emphasizes heavily, but not exclusively, the big four, which is Google, Apple, Amazon, and Facebook. The Europeans have reduced it to GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. GAFA, the big four. And in this book, you throw a lot of challenges before us because consumers and what might be called the consumer complicity or indifference make these companies' power possible. And I want to just summarize your conclusion, which is actually in your prologue, to get the discussion underway. And I'm quoting you. You say, the tech companies are destroying something precious, which is the possibility of contemplation. They have created a world in which we're constantly watched and always distracted. Through their accumulation of data, they have constructed a portrait of our minds, which they use to invisibly guide mass behavior and increasingly individual behavior to further their financial interests. They have eroded the integrity of institutions, media, publishing, that supply the intellectual material that provokes thought and guides democracy. Their most precious asset is our most precious asset, our attention, and they have abused it. The companies have already succeeded in their goal of altering human evolution. We've all become a bit cyborg. Our phone is an extension of our memory. We've outsourced basic mental functions to algorithms. We've handed over our secrets to be stored on servers and mined by computers. What we need to always remember is that we're not just merging with machines, but with the companies that run the machines. This book is about the ideas that fuel these companies and the imperative of resisting them. End quote. Quite an indictment, Frank, and you also indicate that this is just the beginning of the plans of these companies in the coming decades. So why are you telling us that these companies are undermining our own self-control and our own continuing experience with self-government?
So let's go back all the way back. And human beings have always had tools. And those tools have been extensions of us. They've enabled us to do incredible things. And you could even argue that technology is one of the fundamental things that defines us as human beings. But let's just look at the last 10 years, and we've been deluged with the advent of all sorts of incredible technologies. My daughter is 12 years old, and when she was born, there was no iPhone, there was no Kindle, social media was just getting started. And we'd have to say that these creations are magical. They're truly incredible feats of human ingenuity. But the magical qualities of these devices and inventions can distract us from some of the dark sides. And the biggest dark side is that all of these new technologies are not just automating upper body strength, they're not just letting us plow fields, they're not just letting us get around in a more efficient sort of way. These are intellectual technologies. They stand between us and information. They want to create virtual realities that we'll inhabit. They create artificial intelligences, which they hope will be an extension of our own intelligences. And that makes these companies unusually powerful. And everybody wants to compare them to past monopolies, and I think it's possible to fruitfully look back at the industrial age and see some comparisons and to glean some useful antecedents in terms of how we address these companies and understand them. But I think that we need to take them on their own terms and to understand them on their own terms, and the ways in which the powerful technologies that they've created will not just make our lives better, but they also permit these companies to have an incredible amount of control over markets, over culture, over information, and therefore over democracy. And so it's kind of very unfashionable and very unhip to talk about these companies. They have such incredible prestige in this country. But really what's happening and what stands to happen to human beings, where the very definition of what it means to be a human is going to be up for grabs and changing, that power demands that we apply skepticism to these companies. And I think that that skepticism, unfashionable though it may be, is starting to slowly arrive. And we look back at this last election, and I think it was just a breaking point in all sorts of ways. But one of the fundamental ways it was a breaking point is that I think we started to comprehend the extent to which the informational ecosystem we inhabit has started to shift. And, to me, this is the most fundamental question, because a democracy really is only as good as the citizens who inhabit it. And the citizens who inhabit it can only be good citizens if they're receiving quality information. Choices become impossible if we're not well informed. And so we saw in this election the way in which Facebook exerted so much control, and the way in which Facebook over time has eroded mainstream media. And in the process of doing it, it's eroded trust that people have in media and therefore in facts and in information, and eroded a common basis for information. And it's also created these two hive minds. So what Facebook does is that it creates a kind of feedback loop where it learns what we want and then it tries to give us what we want. And so it has this way of driving us into our corners where we're constantly being affirmed. All of our biases are being confirmed. And it's a really dangerous situation because it creates the possibility for mass manipulation.
Let's explain that a little further. 60% of the people tell the pollsters they get their news every day from their Facebook. Exactly how does Facebook shape what is available to them, and how seductive is it?
Right. Well, so when you look at Facebook, part of what makes it so seductive is it seems like your news and information is being curated by your friends. Your friends post things, they share things, and that creates the news ecosystem that you inhabit. But really, that's not the case. I mean, it is true that your friends are posting and sharing things to Facebook, but you're not just getting a reverse chronology of all the things that they've posted. Your friends post an incredible amount of information. And so what Facebook does is it curates that information, and it does it using algorithms, which are procedures and rules that it uses to give things certain priorities over certain other things. And just stepping back and looking at the power of these companies, one of the biggest problems is that they have the power to pick winners and losers in markets and in information and in societies. And that power is frequently invisible to us, so we can't see the ways in which it's being applied. And so to take the example of Facebook, so Facebook ultimately wants to keep you on its site for as long as possible. It wants to keep you clicking, and it uses all of the data that it's amassed. It's created this incredibly intimate portrait of your psyche, and it leverages that information. It knows your habits. It knows the things that your reptilian brain craves, and then it sets out to give you those things because that's what makes them money at the end of the day. And it's just, why is that bad? I think it's bad because the things that we want are oftentimes not the things that we truly need. And so there's the way in which it's kind of dragged down the overall quality of information that gets to citizens. But also it's the way in which our minds just don't function right if we're just getting the information that affirms the things that we believe. And you saw this in the last campaign in the ways in which all sorts of crazy conspiratorial theories of Hillary flourished. And these things mattered. Voters responded to them. And you look at the ways in which the Russians could see from a distance the way in which our informational ecosystem was evolving, and they could see the weak points in it and the ways that they could exploit it. And the Trump campaign, which we kind of laughed at initially and kind of thought that they were inept at campaigns and elections, but they understood the power of this new medium, and they understood how to exploit it, how to gin up enthusiasm among their own supporters using the most demagogic tactics. And Trump had kind of this instinctual feel for this from the start, which was he fomented this crazy conspiracy about Barack Obama not being born in the United States. And that was the thing that launched his presidential campaign. And I don't think he could have gotten away with fomenting that type of conspiracy if it weren't for this new world that Facebook had created.
Yeah. Let's back up a bit here. There have always been monopolies in American economic history, the Standard Oil monopoly, the Sugar Trust, the timber monopoly. And if you didn't want to deal with them, you had some opportunity just to refuse to buy from them. And the antitrust laws, time to time, would break them up. These are new kinds of monopolies you're arguing in this book, World Without Mind. We're talking with Franklin Ford, the author of the new book, World Without Mind. These monopolies are characterized in a variety of ways described in your book. Number one, they want all of your time. They want to control what you see, hear, ingest, buy 24 hours a day. Number two, there's no number two. That is, it isn't like Hertz, Avis is number two to Hertz, or Ford is number two to General Motors. There is no number two to Facebook. There is no number two to Google in this country. There is Samsung, which is challenging Apple, but Apple is pretty much a dominant factor in this country. And when it comes to Facebook, there is no number two. So it's hard to invoke as a consumer choice and competition. And the third characteristic that you point out is that there's a seduction of the consumer who thinks that convenience, price discounts are what is all important, and it isn't privacy, it isn't self-government, it isn't being able to bail out and not be part of the system. And this system of these big four is grounded in fine print contracts. It is supported by companies like Equifax and other firms that make it harder and harder to disentangle ourselves. So the question I want to ask you, Frank, is what's the nature of the resistance? You are skeptical of the current antitrust laws. You indicate these companies have huge political influence over regulators at the FCC, the Federal Trade Commission, over Congress. You paint a rather dismal picture as you end your book with an appeal to the human spirit and the thirst for liberty, freedom, and real choice and self-determination. What is the resistance? I mean, just personally, I don't care for McDonald's, Walmart, and Starbucks for a variety of policy reasons. The first two mistreat their workers. They mistreat people who supply their products overseas, etc. So I've never been in a McDonald's. I've never been in a Walmart. I've never been in a Starbucks. So in other words, I am rejecting through consumer choice these giant companies. But what you're arguing is it's almost impossible to disentangle ourselves from the big four here.
It's possible, but it's very hard because the nature of the network is the core concept of these monopolies, is that they've created this global system that ties us together. And so, of course, it's possible not to be on Facebook, and of course, it's possible to look for search engines that will be an alternative to Google. But a couple things. One is that the system, these guys, on some level, look like they're competing against one another, but really there's this kind of informal détente between them where they compete against one another on the fringes of their businesses occasionally, but there really is no other social network than Facebook, and Google and Apple or Microsoft isn't going to try to create one now. So that's one problem. The second problem is, and one other factor that I don't think you quite describe in that long list of reasons why these monopolies are different, is data. Is that these companies have surveilled us relentlessly. They track us everywhere. Their advantage over their competitors is that they have the most complete portrait of our mind. And that portrait allows them to keep us clicking, to manipulate us even more, to provide us the services that we don't even know that we need. And then finally, the other significant thing is exactly what you're getting at, which is that these companies were born at a moment when the regulatory structure of this country was the laxest it's been in 100 years. The Chicago School of Economics has come to dominate our approach to reining in business. So if you were to go back to even the Nixon administration, antitrust policies were being applied in a bipartisan sort of way to accomplish goals that extended beyond keeping consumer prices low. And so only in this sort of lax regulatory environment could these companies spring into being with these monopolies.
Not only that, but it was federal tax money and federal R&D that helped create the basic science that launched these companies to begin with.
But just one other point on this, which is that you talked about the old oligopolies, the McDonald's, Starbucks, the Walmarts, et cetera, and it takes these new monopolies to make even kind of hardened liberal consumer activists sympathetic to the old oligopolies. I mean, I look at Walmart and the effective tax rate that it pays, it's about twice as high as the tax rate that Amazon pays. And so because Amazon is able to relocate all of its intellectual property in Luxembourg and other tax havens around the world, and it just doesn't pay a whole lot of tax. And because Walmart is a physical store located in places, it has to pay about twice as much tax. And so when a company like Walmart is even so disadvantaged when it comes to competing against Amazon, you have a real problem. And I don't know if you guys have talked about on the show this week Amazon's campaign to build a new headquarters, which to me is kind of perfectly emblematic of the way in which it's gone around advertising its intentions, begging for the biggest amount of tax breaks and subsidies to build a new headquarters. It's a perfect example of how size begets bigger size and how we get trapped in these cycles where once a company gets a leg up, it's able to plunder the state and exploit the system in order to get even greater advantage.
Just imagine, it's like an empire. It's basically waving this second headquarters before a number of cities, insisting on certain requirements, demanding over $8 billion in a tax incentive package by these cities in order to decide which city they're going to locate these headquarters in. And there's very little challenge to it. It's like, look at all the stories that are being written with San Diego and Chicago and St. Louis, and they're all running around figuring how much they're going to give from you, the taxpayer, to let Amazon make even more profit. In your book, you have a devastating description of how Amazon avoided sales taxes for years and saved huge amounts of money to the disadvantage of brick and mortar stores who had to pay sales taxes around the country, not to mention property taxes. You want to describe that?
Yes. So we look at Amazon's monopoly and we say, wow, this is just a marvel of great business practice. Jeff Bezos is a genius. But really, one of the great advantages that he had is that his products, the product that he was selling people was cheaper because he just found a way to have consumers avoid paying state sales tax. And so his monopoly was actually built in a profoundly unfair sort of way where he was exploiting a loophole, a giant loophole in the system that lobbyists had actually managed to create initially. And so it wasn't such a marvel of ingenuity. And we shouldn't just say he deserves his advantages because he was better than everybody else.
Well, you talk about some of the future pitfalls for these giant corporations in the context of trying to figure out how to sort out a more democratic society and political economy. And you refer to what you call the big one. What do you mean when you say the big one?
What I mean is that these companies have amassed so much data. They've eroded so much of our privacy. And privacy for most Americans is a very theoretical concern. We know that we care about our privacy. We want to protect our privacy. But we also have grown so accustomed to our privacy existing in a relatively untrammeled sort of way that we just don't fully appreciate all the ways in which we're being followed and surveilled and our data is being mined. And so I surmise that there's going to be a moment. We can't predict what will precipitate this moment, but there'll be some sort of hack that will rumble society to its core, that the hack will do something to fundamentally disrupt finance, personal finance, that it'll do something fundamental to disrupt our private lives, and that when that moment arrives, it's important that we be prepared for it, that we have some sort of plan for taking advantage of the crisis to create a much better protective system for privacy. And for me, the questions of privacy and competition need to be interlinked in a way that they haven't been here. The Europeans have done a much better job of thinking through this problem, but part of the reason that these companies are able to extend their monopolies is that they have this advantage in how they surveil us. And to maintain their advantage, they're going to keep pushing the barriers of surveillance, and they're going to keep eroding more and more of our privacy. And so I think hemming in these companies also means hemming in their ability to surveil us. And we should look at these problems holistically. And maybe after a big one, we can install a holistic regulatory system.
Well, there was a big one just recently with Equifax. Over 125 million accounts of customers have been hacked. Nobody knows what the hackers are going to do with it all. They get their Social Security numbers, their credit history, personal information about how they live through their consumer choices, what their credit rating is, etc. And you hear about this. Target was hacked a couple years ago. And people, I think, don't see the effect of what the word privacy entails. It entails the most intimate information about your personal lives, your friends, your relatives, your relation with doctors, lawyers, clergy, what your aspirations were, what you want kept secret even from your closest friends or relatives. The braggers of the internet age for these companies say that they know more about you than you do because you're restricted by human memory lapses and the machine is not. So you make a big point of this in terms of the whole tradition of liberty in our country. And our founding fathers, put liberty on a higher pedestal than convenience or even security. That was their priority when they established the constitutional system. So let's get your thoughts on resistance here. There's an effort in some quarters in this country to only use cash, that consumers are being asked, you want to get out of this system, you got to get out of the credit debit network because that's the fundamental framework by which you get trapped and you get seduced and you get stuck in a cul-de-sac with these companies and with the banks and insurance companies, etc. Just use cash. But there's now increasing pressure, corporate coercion against people who use cash. Try to go to a hotel, try to rent a car, try to use FedEx. You can't use it if you pay cash. So you can see the doors closing, Frank. And the question is, do we need to start thinking about a cooperative sub-economy where people create their own sub-economy, their own food stores, their own community credit facilities, their own adult education, their own renewable energy, in a more self-contained sub-economy in order to carve out an arena of freedom and self-control and determination? Have you thought about that at all, or do you have other suggestions on how the Big Four?
Let's start with the core problem, which is that I really do worry about the survival of our democracy because the way in which our media has been so eroded. And this is, again, what you were saying before, which is that old corporate media was despicable in so many ways, but we can see what's replacing it, and it's even more dangerous and more despicable. And so, I think what we need to do is find ways to nurture quality information because the survival of our democracy depends on that. And so we have to make more virtuous choices for ourselves. We have to find ways to become benefactors for media that we believe in and to find ways to extend the reach of that. And I think media itself needs to find a way to push back against these companies. So in terms of personal resistance, I think I haven't thought it through in quite the same way that you have, looking for opportunities to drop out in quite that sort of way. But I think that the analogy is fundamentally correct, which is that when you have kind of a total system like the ones that we're describing, you have to look for the seams. You have to look for the places where you can disengage. And to me, there's this question of human survival that's at the core of it, which is that in order to continue to be human beings capable of contemplation, we need to find vehicles for tending to our minds. And that means creating spaces where we're not umbilically connected to corporate stores, where we're not constantly being dinged and distracted with notifications and with emails and the like. And it's impossible to completely leave that world of screens. We all live on the world of screens, and there's a lot of good that comes with that. But I think that we need to keep thinking, because that's really the thing that's most in danger here, is our capacity to be independent thinking human beings.
Look at the younger generation. They've never had more access to information all over the world at fingertip content. And in my experience, they know less than even their preceding generation about basic facts of the society and the world. I gave a speech recently at Harvard Law School, and I introduced my remarks by saying, you are law students who have been valedictorians, top of your class at various universities, but you're factually unprepared to go to law school. You don't know anything about corporate power. You don't know anything about the distribution of power. You know nothing about tort law, nothing about contract law, nothing about how the tax system, other than a general way, manipulates the allocation of receipts and public budgets. This paradox, it's like there's so much information overload that the Big Four that you're talking about are proceeding to select it, especially for the bigger users of these technologies, which tend to be the younger generation. So other than...
Look at the cultural prestige that these companies have. I mean, yesterday was the launch, the day before we recorded this broadcast, was the launch of the new Apple phone. And just the amount of fanfare and hoopla and obsession that greets the launch of a consumer product. I mean, in the past, everybody may have, McDonald's may have had this magnetic attraction for consumers, but it's hard to really think of corporations that have managed to garner the levels of adulation and hype and prestige that these companies do. And that feels to me almost a really dangerous fundamental shift.
Yes, it goes to your point of distraction. There's a kind of culture of technical twits who are fascinated more and more by less and less tweaks of the technology that they hold in their hands or they look at their screens at. And one of the results of distraction is that we have more than ever abandoned the public airwaves to corporate advertisers and corporate programming. And so you look at television, radio now, and it doesn't have to meet any FCC standards of, quote, the public interest, convenience, and necessity, end quote. It doesn't have to ascertain local information needs. It basically is an advertising media with junk programming. And does the young care about this? They don't even know about this. They're not watching TV. They're watching screens. So this distraction is self-immolating in terms of a democratic society. One thing I liked about your book is the big picture here. You're not just focusing on the seduction of consumers and their complicity in supporting these companies, because sooner or later Amazon's going to be a big monopoly if it isn't stopped, and then the prices are going to go up for sure. You're talking about the democratic future of our country. You want to elaborate that a bit?
Yeah, because democracy, as I've said, requires people to be independent thinkers, and it requires us to make good decisions. The hero of my book is really Louis Brandeis, who is somebody who's fallen out of favor over time. He was, of course, a Supreme Court justice, and he was also the guy who did the most to formulate our ideas about privacy, as well as being perhaps the greatest enemy of monopoly in this country. And for me, he got it exactly right, which is that part of the reason that he saw monopolies as so dangerous was that he saw the ways in which people become dependent on monopolies. He feared that workers wouldn't feel like they could be independent enough to vote their mind or formulate their own opinions if they became dependent on their employer, became dependent on a monopoly. And he also formulated the idea of privacy in a way that seems to me that best gets at the concept, which is that in order to think independent thoughts, we can't be afraid that somebody is watching over our shoulder. That as soon as we start to sense that somebody is watching us while we think, we begin to formulate our thoughts to appease our audience. And so we become, if we're being watched, we become more cautious, we become less subversive. And both of these things are tremendous, tremendous dangers for monopoly. And what Brandeis did, which I think needs to come back into vogue, was that he didn't sit around obsessing over whether companies were supplying the lowest prices. He was obsessing about how these companies would affect democracies writ large. He was worried about us as citizens and not just as consumers.
That's right. And Louis Brandeis co-authored a law review article over 100 years ago showing that privacy is rooted in our Constitution, obviously in the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, etc. And so he was very influential in that sense. Now, in your book, you propose a data protection authority to get the privacy issue under some sort of public protection. You want to explain that?
So I am interested in trying to find a way to force the system back into the sorts of paradigms that you described before. So data is like the environment. It's not a good that these companies own. It's a good that they exploit. And so just as we let companies exploit the environment to a certain extent, we could certainly let companies exploit data to a certain extent, but they shouldn't be permitted to act as if they actually own the data. The data, at the end of the day, is ours. And so we need a regulatory system that shifts the balance back to this fundamental recognition of who actually owns the data. And so if they're going to be permitted to use data, they're going to have to accept responsibility for that. And that means that the government should be able to impose a system upon these companies that makes them act in the public interest as they exploit our data. It's just astonishing how little our system does to protect privacy and protect data. There's no comprehensive law protecting data in this country.
Well, in that vein, do you favor that the consumers who give all that free information, personal information to Facebook, should have a proprietary right of ownership and be able to charge Facebook for use of that information, which is the basis of Facebook's profits, of course?
Yeah, I think that that's an interesting idea. I think we need a cleaner solution than that. I think as consumers, we need to be able to bargain with these guys from a position of much greater leverage, that the terms of service use that you alluded to earlier, are so abusive, and we click them without reading them and without feeling like we have any sort of choice in the matter. And if you want to opt out of the system in any sort of way, it requires mastering a complicated bureaucratic system that's set up to prevent our ability from escaping their desire to peer more deeply into our lives. And
as I've said, underneath all is the fine print contract, which is what you're referring to.
Exactly, and we need to recognize what these companies are doing. They're playing a bureaucratic trick on us. In some ways, these are innovative companies, but they also are incredibly bureaucratic. They subject us to forms and rules, and they try to obscure our ability to navigate our ways out of this system. And so the law should be much more forceful in demanding that these companies be straighter with us and demand that these companies give us greater agency over our privacy.
In your book you say, quote, citizens, not the corporations that stealthily track them, should own their own data. The law should demand that these companies treat this data with the greatest care because it doesn't belong to them. And elsewhere in your book, you say consumers should have the choice of opting out, not simply be assumed that they've opted in some fine print contract of many pages.
Yes. These are oppressive documents. These terms of service agreements give them incredible amounts of latitude and immunity. And as consumers, we feel like we have no recourse. And what kind of system is that, where consumers feel like they have no recourse over things that are so intimate and that actually, in the end, really do belong to them?
You go back to a traditional proposal where you say on page 203, very clearly written book, by the way, listeners. It may seem confusing, but it's very, very clearly written. And you say, the health of our democracy demands we consider treating Facebook, Google, and Amazon with the same firm hand that led government to wage war on AT&T, IBM, and Microsoft, namely monopolies at that time. Even, you say, dismembering them into smaller companies if circumstances in the law demand a forceful response, end quote. Well, supposedly they are broken up, but they all behave the same way, a sort of parallel oligopoly. Would that change anything?
Look, as liberals and reformers, we're trapped into oftentimes a binary way of thinking about corporate size, where we have these two traditions. We have the Brandeis tradition, which is you try to create smallness. You're afraid of big concentrations of power. And then there's the kind of Teddy Roosevelt approach, which leads us to greater and greater regulation, where there's some sort of acceptance of size as an inevitability. And I don't think it's an either-or sort of choice. We need to have a system where we use the power of our antitrust laws, the original antitrust laws as they were written, not as they've been reinterpreted over time, to try to create smaller companies and to try to prevent them from extending their arms into the next areas of technology, but that we also have regulatory solutions that we apply in an extremely sort of aggressive way. Because the truth is, even if we were to break these companies up, they would still have very strong incentives to keep surveilling us and to exploit our privacy and to abuse their power. So we need to use all the tools in our chest.
Well, I'd like you to draw the listeners' attention to the last two chapters, which are short, one called The Organic Mind and the other called The Paper Rebellion. The basic framework, listeners, I would suggest is that as long as Facebook, Google, and the other monopolists that we're discussing in this book spend infinitely more time figuring out ways to control you, to try to persuade you that because some things are discounted or some things are free, that you should surrender your being to their marketing framework. As long as they spend far more time than we as people spend trying to figure out how to escape their control, how to live a higher quality life, they're going to make Aldous Huxley's Brave New World look like an understatement. It's way beyond 1984 now. Orwell, It's Brave New World. And so I was intrigued in the chapter, The Organic Mind. You start out by saying, quote, the optimistic prospects for escaping the pull of Facebook, Google, and Amazon come in the form of yogurt, granola, and mash, end quote. Can you explain that?
So we look at food, and I draw an extended analogy to food. So we had the emergence of processed foods, TV dinners, and the like, and the culture embraced them because it seemed like they were godsends, that we didn't have to go shopping every day, and we didn't need to clean up pots and pans, and they were incredibly cheap. And then we woke up 50 years later, maybe people knew this earlier, but that these foods were engineered to make us fat, that they disrupted a whole economy, leading to greater and greater concentration. And my fear is that the same thing is happening now with the things that we ingest through our minds, and that content is becoming more processed. And I use the word content. It's a horrible word. It reflects everything that's wrong with the way that we think about journalism and information and culture now. But it's a pretty dark comparison, except for one thing, which is that when it comes to food, there's been a backlash, and that people started to care a lot more about the things that they ingest. And so they've started to sacrifice efficiency in order to buy foods that are organic or that they believe haven't been polluted with pesticides or whatever, and that they've started to shop at farmers markets because they want to be more intimately connected to the production of food. And my hope is that we can extend that parallel into knowledge and culture, and that we can make the same sorts of virtuous choices that at least some people make when it comes to food, that we should care deeply about how information is produced. And you know what? We're going to have to pay for it. This expectation that we can get quality information for free has turned out to be a really dangerous assumption. It's driven the quality of information down to levels where we get Donald Trump as president. And so, I think that there is some hope ultimately that we can have some sort of cultural counter-revolution that can push back against the tides.
What do you think the schools should do other than try to put a computer in front of every 9-year-old's pupil?
First of all, Silicon Valley has extended its reach into these schools, and they've tried
huge.
Yeah, and that's a scandal, and that we need to push back against that. But the other thing that I think is important is that we need to treat computer science in a different sort of way. That we live in a world where computer science has this dominion over everything right now, because everything can be reduced to algorithms and to code. And unfortunately, the people who have this power are people who are trained to think only in terms of efficiency, only in terms of systems, because that's the ethos of computer science. And so I think we actually need to encourage a more humanistic approach to computer science, where we don't just teach kids how to code and to program, but we need to teach them how to think ethically, and we need to teach them how to think about moral and political problems, so that we're not just leaving the system in the hands of people who are trying to design things in a way that is maximally efficient.
Yeah, the pressure is computer literacy, and I once told a group of educators I'd settle for literacy. You end your book with a chapter called The Paper Rebellion. You think there's a movement back to paper, back to reading books you can hold in your hand and not just look at Kindle? I see that trend as well, but what do you think?
Well, we've seen this with the resurgence of independent bookstores. I mean, one of the hopeful things is the way in which the death of Barnes & Noble and Borders cleared out this space for independent bookstores, which have become communal gathering places, and people have become attached to them, not just because they want to go there to shop, but because I think that they represent this kind of spirit of resistance that we're talking about, where they're not corporate, they're not homogenized, and where they actually feel organically connected to the places that we live. And so that's hopeful to me. And then the other thing is that I think as people have gravitated back to paper books, which has happened for two reasons, by the way. One is that the publishers actually were aggressive in trying to maintain their ability to control price. And this is a crucial thing. I actually think price-fixing laws need to be relaxed in the face of these monopolies, because producers need to be much more empowered in our system and need to have much better position to bargain against Amazon and Walmart. But anyways, so that's one thing. And the other is that I feel like people have this sense that they need a break from their screens, and so they've gravitated back to paper as a place where they can have private thoughts, where they can recharge their minds, where they can be engaged in thinking and contemplation in a less trammeled sort of way. And so I do feel some measure of optimism, even having produced a pretty bleak apocalyptic book.
We're talking with Franklin Foer, the author of the new book, World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. One thing that I would urge you to do, the companies like to monopolize words like efficiency and low price. People pay low price for Wonder Bread and other fat, sugar, salt-containing foods, but then they pay a huge price in terms of damage to their health, high blood pressure, youth diabetes, etc. The same with efficiency. Efficiency, corporate definition, is usually very short term. It's an efficiency that breeds the conditions for devastating costs later on, such as in our motor vehicle technology. So you do end in a hopeful note, and I'd just like to read your last short paragraph to our listeners. Quote, "We have deluded ourselves into caring more deeply about convenience and efficiency than about the things that last. Compared to the sustaining nourishment of the contemplative life and the deep commitment to text, many of the promiscuous pleasures of the web are vanishing. The contemplative life remains freely available to us through our choices, what we read and buy, how we commit to leisure and self-improvement, the passing over of empty temptation, our preservation of the quiet spaces, and intentional striving to become masters of our mastery." End quote. So to show that it's not as easy as even the most hopeful people think, let me ask you a personal question. Are you still shopping Amazon?
I do. This is the hard part, and this is why I think I try to make better choices in my life, and I've succeeded somewhat in doing that. But in the end, what it's going to take is a political solution to these problems, that as individuals we can do a lot to create spaces for us. I think I try to do a lot to practice what I preach in that paragraph, but there's some ways in which these corporations are inescapable.
It would help all of us as consumers if the competition began to challenge the big four, well, certainly Amazon. If the competition begins to challenge Amazon, Walmart is developing a strategy through acquisitions to challenge Amazon. But as our local hardware store owner once said, "Why is Amazon so appealing? When you come to my store, you get instant delivery. You buy it, you pick it up, and you go home." So I think we do need the contemplative life. We need people to get your book into libraries around the country, to start discussions at independent bookstores, and to pay homage to posterity, which is likely to curse us if we don't wake up to our civic and democratic pretensions. Thank you very much, Franklin Foer.
Thank you so much, Ralph.
We've been speaking to Franklin Foer, author of World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. And in a big tech way, we will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now let's find out the latest monkey shines going on in corporate America with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. Take it away, Russell.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, September 15, 2017. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A number of public interest groups are calling on Congress to hold hearings to investigate whether Wells Fargo deliberately misled federal lawmakers during an active investigation. The group suggests Wells Fargo executives, including former CEO John Stumpf, may have knowingly and deliberately withheld information related to its fraudulent insurance sales practices during congressional hearings held in September 2016. According to the bank's own timeline, Wells Fargo learned in July 2016 that more than 800,000 customers had been charged for auto insurance they did not need, and the bank ended the activity around the same time that Stumpf testified before the two banking committees about Wells Fargo's fraudulent account scandal. Yet Stumpf's testimony made no mention of this misconduct, even when he was asked directly whether fraudulent activity might exist in other business lines. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. David?
Ralph, Senator Bernie Sanders this week released a new plan to provide every single American free health insurance. 2 years from now, where do you think this will be?
Well, the bill projects implementation over 4 years, and it does have a target of universal health insurance coverage, but it's not as pure a single-payer system as H.R. 676 in the House of Representatives, which has a majority of House Democrats signed on, led by Congressman John Conyers. However, the trend is in the direction of universal coverage. The public opinion is increasing in that direction, and the politicians who have their finger to the wind back home are starting to get the message. So I think it's going to be a major issue in next year's congressional election, but only the right way if people flood those town meetings and laser beam focus on their senators and representatives, that we want to end to the anxiety, to the preventable deaths, to the fine print trap doors, to the gouging, to the waivers, to the deductibles, to the exclusions. We want peace of mind, universal, affordable, accessible health insurance that comes in much more efficient than the present corrupt system and covers everybody without any exceptions.
Now, Ralph, I happened to tune into MSNBC today where they brought this up. And of course, most of the conversation was about how this would affect the horse race in congressional elections. But they also said when they did the polling, it doesn't poll as well when you say it's going to be higher taxes. How would you answer that question that, yeah, they're going to have to raise taxes in order to have this?
Well, the taxes have to be raised on corporations and the wealthy. Number two, people should say, how much am I saving because I'm not paying any health insurance premiums and other direct medical bills. And number three, they should realize that Canada, which has a single-payer system, comes in at $4,500 per capita, covering everybody. We're up to $9,500 average per capita, and there are tens of millions of people not even covered and many more undercovered. So it has to be explained that way. If it's just unilaterally explained as a tax increase, it's going to depress the supporting level of the polls.
Yeah, and that's how, unfortunately, it was framed on this little clip that I saw. All right, so let's go to some listener questions. And this first one, actually, there are two related questions we kind of touched on in the Franklin Forer work, and it concerns Equifax. And Ed Ferrisquia says, please speak on the Equifax data breach, in particular that company's despicable move to force arbitration on victims as a condition of using their site just to see if we were one of the affected.
Well, Equifax is one of the three big credit rating firms and providing credit scores distribution around the collars of American consumers. And it also has been lobbying for even less regulation than the minor regulation that covers these credit rating companies. So my approach to this basically is to push a drive for complete regulation. They're out of control. They're beginning to charge people more and more to have access to their own data that they assemble that establishes the credit rating or the credit score. And you just can't piecemeal reform these companies. There has to be congressional hearings, state legislative hearings, push the legislators. They're very concerned about this because the majority of people do not like these credit rating firms.
And another listener who goes by the name Eri asked, what precautionary steps can one take?
Well, my favorite is stay in the cash economy if you can. And if you have to have a credit card services that don't accept cash, use third parties like travel agencies for getting an airline ticket for your vacation. If you can't do that, you've got to be very careful about the information you voluntarily give to companies that then funnel it to these credit rating firms.
This question comes from Stephen Guggen. Are there any countries with laws that require companies to be or be en route to being member and or worker owned in order to receive taxpayer dollars or tax breaks?
A very imaginative proposal. I don't know of any country that does that, but that's really a good incentive to decentralize companies and put them in the hands of worker-owned. And in the area of nonprofit consumer co-ops, because they don't produce profits, they're not taxed on their profits. Their surplus is usually rebated back to the consumers. So there is a tax incentive for consumer co-ops. They have other burdens that they have to surmount, of course, but none, to my knowledge, for worker-owned enterprises.
And listener Arlene Crooks wants to know where she can get some cheap legal advice. She believes Bank of America has been charging her unfairly on a loan she's been paying for 17 years. And when she spoke to the bank manager, he suggested she contact a lawyer.
Well, I suggest that she contact Ed Merzvinsky, who's a longtime advocate working with the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, a consumer group funded by college students, surprisingly enough, and canvassing door to door. You can reach Ed Merzvinsky, who's an expert on bank shenanigans, by calling U.S. PIRG, look it up, the phone number is available, or by going to uspirg.org, that's uspirg.org.
Well, very good. Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming either on Ralph's Facebook page or on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. I want to thank our guest today, Franklin Foer, author of World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show.
For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. I understand you have an event this weekend, Ralph, at the Tort Museum.
Yes, the legendary Phil Donahue will be coming to the Tort Museum. He's an early founder, but he hasn't visited it yet. And he'll be having a session with the constitutional law expert, Professor Akil Reed Amar of Yale Law School, Sunday, September 17th. That happens to be Constitution Day in Connecticut, which is called the Constitution State. The event is 2 to 3:30, Sunday, September 17th. For more details, go to tortmuseum.org about how you can attend this unique event.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin.
Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you very much. The program gives a lot of material for us to contemplate on. And I hope our listeners will extend what they heard today to their friends and relatives and coworkers.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you. Listen to me, people. Do you understand? We gotta stand up. Oh, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, step up. You